One is a moment that often goes unnoticed at first. It's not dramatic. Nothing explodes. No confrontation announces it. It begins quietly, when something in the dynamic shifts and the narcissist senses it before you do. Control, for a narcissist, is not simply about dominance or power in the obvious sense. It is a psychological structure, an internal scaffolding that holds their identity together. Control is how they regulate themselves, how they manage shame, how they stabilize a fragile sense of self that cannot exist without external reinforcement. When you were inside their orbit, control did not always feel like control. It often felt like intensity, or closeness, or being seen, at least initially. The early stage often carried a sense of emotional acceleration, a fast-tracked intimacy that felt meaningful rather than manipulative. You were mirrored, studied, attuned to, not because they wanted to know you, but because they needed to know how to orient themselves around you. Over time, that attunement subtly changed. It became correction, calibration, emotional pressure that was difficult to name. You may have noticed that conversations slowly began to revolve around their moods, their reactions, their interpretations of events. Your inner world became less central, even as you were told how important you were. This is where control starts to form, not through overt restriction, but through reality shaping. A narcissistic dynamic does not require you to be weak. It requires you to be human, to have empathy, to reflect, to question yourself when something feels off. And so, when inconsistencies appear, when affection is followed by withdrawal, when warmth gives way to coldness, the mind looks for coherence. You try to understand. You fill in gaps. You assume complexity where there is actually instability. That confusion is not accidental. It is functional. Inside the narcissist, there is a constant monitoring process. They track emotional supply the way a system tracks fuel. Approval, admiration, emotional responsiveness. These are not extras. They are regulators. Without them, the narcissist experiences something close to psychic freefall. But the supply only works if it is predictable. If they can pull it closer when needed, withdraw when they choose, and reassert dominance when uncertainty threatens their position. Control ensures predictability, and predictability keeps panic at bay. This is why autonomy in the other person is so destabilizing. You may not have recognized the moment you became less controllable. Often, it happens internally long before behavior changes. A subtle detachment, a quiet emotional withdrawal. You stop explaining yourself as much. You pause before responding. You no longer rush to repair every rupture. From the outside, nothing may have changed significantly, but internally, the dynamic has shifted. The narcissist feels it as a disturbance in the field. Their reactions may become sharper or more erratic. They may escalate charm, suddenly attentive again. Or they may become colder, more dismissive, as if punishing you for a violation you were never told existed. This is not random. It is a response to perceived loss of control. For the narcissist, losing control over you does not mean losing influence in a practical sense. It means losing regulation. You were part of how they stabilize themselves. When that stabilizer weakens, anxiety rises. And because narcissists cannot metabolize anxiety internally, it must be externalized. Projection intensifies. Blame shifts. You may be accused of being distant, selfish, disloyal, ungrateful, often for behaviors that look, on the surface, like emotional self-respect. At this stage, you may find yourself trying to clarify misunderstandings that never resolve. The rules keep changing. What reassured them yesterday now irritates them today. What they once praised becomes evidence of your inadequacy. This instability is not strategic in the way it is sometimes portrayed. It is reactive. The narcissist is attempting to regain equilibrium through control. When subtle methods fail, pressure increases. And here is where cognitive dissonance deepens for the person on the receiving end. You remember who they were at the beginning. You remember moments of connection that felt real. And so, when the tone shifts, you look inward. You wonder what you did wrong. You try to restore harmony by adjusting yourself. This is how identity erosion begins. Not through overt domination, but through gradual self-abandonment in service of relational stability. The narcissist does not need to tell you who to be. They only need to make it unsafe for you to be yourself. Over time, you may notice that expressing disagreement feels risky, that having independent emotional responses invites consequences, that your inner experience becomes something to manage rather than honor. From the narcissist's perspective, this is not cruelty, it is survival. They experience your independence as a threat, not because independence is harmful, but because it disrupts their internal balance. Control allows them to avoid confronting something far more terrifying than conflict, their own emptiness. When control begins to slip, panic does not always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like indifference, or superiority, or sudden emotional detachment. These are defenses, attempts to reassert dominance by pretending not to care. Other times, panic looks like intensity, a sudden surge of attention, apologies that feel theatrical rather than grounded, promises that echo past promises but lack follow-through. Both responses serve the same function, to pull you back into orbit. What makes this phase particularly disorienting is that the narcissist may simultaneously accuse you of controlling them. Projection operates here with precision. The very autonomy that destabilizes them is reframed as manipulation. This reversal can leave you doubting your own perception. You may begin to ask whether setting boundaries is selfish, whether emotional distance is cruelty, whether your need for clarity is unreasonable. The erosion is subtle. It happens in the space between what you feel and what you are told is real. As this continues, something else begins to shift. You may feel emotionally exhausted, numb, less reactive. Not because you are healed, but because your nervous system is overwhelmed. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted by the narcissist as defiance. They sense disengagement. And disengagement, for someone dependent on control, feels like annihilation. This is where the dynamic approaches a breaking point. Not in action, but internally. The narcissist experiences a growing sense of instability. Their usual tools no longer work as effectively. You are not responding the way you used to. The emotional leverage is weakening. They may intensify behaviors that once guaranteed compliance. Silent treatment becomes longer. Rage becomes more cutting. Or they may pivot toward an external source of validation, a new supply. Not because you are irrelevant, but because your unpredictability has become intolerable. Throughout this process, you may still be trying to understand, to make sense of contradictions, to reconcile who they said they were with who they are showing themselves to be. There is no clean answer here, only a gradual recognition that something is structurally wrong. Control was never about love, it was about regulation. And as that control begins to fail, the system strains. Not outwardly at first, internally, quietly. The panic is building, even if it has not yet found its expression. When control is finally lost, it does not happen in a single moment. It happens in layers, and the narcissist feels each layer fall away long before it becomes visible to anyone else. What they lose first is not you, but the certainty they once had over your emotional availability. The predictability of your responses, the reassurance that, no matter what they did, you would remain engaged, explaining, reacting, trying. This loss creates an internal disturbance that the narcissist cannot soothe from within. Their self-concept depends on external confirmation, and when that confirmation becomes unreliable, their internal narrative begins to fracture. The first response is often denial. They may convince themselves that they are still in control, that your withdrawal is temporary, that a familiar tactic will restore the balance. There may be an almost casual cruelty at this stage, dismissiveness, belittling remarks, a calculated coldness designed to provoke a reaction. Any reaction will do. Anger, tears, protest, engagement. Silence, however, is intolerable. Because silence does not feed the system. As it becomes clear that the old methods no longer work, panic sharpens. This panic is not always visible as fear. More often it manifests as rage. Not explosive rage necessarily, but a simmering hostility, a brittle defensiveness that surfaces in subtle ways. They may rewrite history, reframe the relationship as something they endured rather than relied upon. Smear campaigns often begin here, not primarily to punish you, but to stabilize their image. Reputation becomes a substitute for lost control. If they can convince others, and themselves, that you were the problem, they can preserve a sense of superiority that protects them from collapse. Internally, however, the structure is destabilizing. Without control over you, the narcissist is forced to confront something they have spent their life avoiding: the absence of a coherent self, the emptiness beneath the performance, the fragile core that cannot tolerate reflection. Rather than integrate this awareness, they split it off, project it outward. You become the embodiment of everything they cannot face: disloyalty, coldness, cruelty, instability. This projection allows them to maintain a false sense of superiority even as their internal world grows more chaotic. At the same time, a strange contradiction emerges. They may oscillate between devaluing you and idealizing your absence. They may stalk from a distance, emotionally or literally, not out of longing, but out of a need to monitor, to ensure that you are still affected, still oriented toward them in some way. Knowing that you are not destabilized by their withdrawal is deeply unsettling. It suggests that they were not as central to your identity as they believed, and that belief, that they were essential, was foundational to their sense of power. This is where collapse can begin. Collapse does not always look dramatic. Often, it looks like increased rigidity. Grandiosity becomes louder. Empathy becomes thinner. Their narratives grow more extreme, less nuanced, more absolute. They may attach quickly to new sources of supply, not because of genuine connection, but because they need immediate stabilization. These new dynamics often mirror the early stages of what you experienced: intensity without depth, closeness without intimacy. Externally, they may appear unfazed, even thriving. Internally, however, something has shifted irreversibly. The loss of control over you introduced a crack in the structure. A reminder that their influence is not absolute, that their power depends on consent, something they cannot fully command. Meanwhile, something else is happening quietly within you. Not a victory, not a sense of triumph, but a gradual reorganization of your internal world. Without the constant pressure to regulate someone else's emotions, your nervous system begins to settle, unevenly at first. There may be grief, confusion, moments of longing that feel contradictory to what you know. This does not mean the bond was healthy. Trauma bonds are powerful precisely because they intertwine distress with connection. As distance grows, the bond weakens, not through force, but through absence. You may notice that your thoughts become less preoccupied with explaining, less consumed by proving your reality. The mental loops begin to slow. This is not empowerment in the dramatic sense. It is reclamation through quiet. As your internal alignment returns, the narcissist attempts to reassert control feel increasingly hollow. Their words no longer penetrate in the same way. Their accusations lose coherence. This is often when hoovering attempts occur, not always obvious, sometimes indirect. A message framed as concern, a reminder of shared history, a sudden acknowledgement of pain. These attempts are not about repair. They are about restoring equilibrium, their equilibrium. If these attempts fail, withdrawal resumes, and with it, the preservation of a narrative that allows them to survive psychologically without confronting their own role. For you, the significance is not in what they do next, but in what no longer happens inside you. The urgency fades. The compulsion to engage softens. You are no longer trying to extract understanding from someone who cannot provide it. This is where power shifts, not outwardly, but internally. Power was never about dominance. It was about sovereignty, about owning your internal experience without needing validation from someone invested in distorting it. The narcissist's panic at losing control was never about losing you as a person. It was about losing a function, a mirror, a regulator. And once that function is no longer available, their system adapts in ways that protect them, not in ways that heal. Your system, on the other hand, begins to do something different. It integrates. There is no celebration here, no moment of triumph, only a quiet clarity. A recognition that what you experienced had a structure, that the confusion was not a personal failure, but a predictable outcome of a disordered dynamic. The story does not end with punishment or justice. It ends with understanding. And understanding, calm, grounded, unspectacular, is what finally removes you from their control.